Well, hi, I'm Todd Nash, President of Oregon Cattlemen's Association. I'm here today with Clint Sexson, our Marketing Committee Chair. And Clint, I'm going to turn it over to you for further introductions, where you're at, and how you've been involved in Oregon Cattlemen's.
Thanks, Todd, and good morning. Um, I live in the Columbia Basin area in Stanfield, Oregon, and have been fairly actively involved in the marketing committee the last year. And as Todd knows, prior to that, I was an active member of our local county cattlemen's. Been very involved in the commercial cow-calf sector in Oregon the last 20 years, I guess, in different positions.
Yeah, thanks, Clint. And one of the things that comes up here is people go to the meat case in their supermarkets and they look at the price of beef and they say, you guys as cattlemen must be doing awful well because this is expensive beef. Can you talk about the gap that we see in between what cattle are and what is at the meat case?
Sure. So I think that gap is something that most consumers don't really understand. I mean, they're paying, even for what we would consider our lower end cuts, they're paying a pretty premium price. And the profit margin in there is rendered in the middle of the scheme, if you will. If we're looking at it in an hourglass shape, we've got the cow-calf producer at the bottom and the consumer at the top, and right in the middle where it gets real tight, in the shape of the hourglass, is the packing and the processing industry. And right there is probably where the biggest jam up is in price. We are at the mercy of those people in terms of price as we sell our calves, not only at the cow-calf level, but if we're feeding them out and maintaining ownership, we're at the mercy of the market right there in the middle. And then they add on all the costs from there going forward. And so at the meat case, you're seeing a product that's pretty high priced, and the trickle down is really pennies on the dollar that comes back to the cow-calf, man.
Okay. Well, thanks for that summary. And here in the Northwest, we have kind of an interesting dynamic here in with our cattle kind of being isolated from the cattle that go back into the Midwest, and some of the price discovery that takes place back there with fat cattle. Even our feed, we have kind of a captive amount of feed here. Do you want to talk about that dynamic that takes place just within the Northwest here?
Yeah, and I would say, it's unique just because it's set off, literally 12 to 1600 miles from real good sources of feed. And I'm talking where we've got, the biggest source of our corn is growing in the Midwest. And so our packing industry is concentrated there. So in the Northwest, we basically have a small group of packers. And, as a result, there's very little cash trade here that happens, especially in Oregon, Washington, even into California, Idaho. And as a result, there's a lot of these contracts already in place. And it's made our group of producers very progressive. I think our genetics stand for themselves. A lot of the cattle that are sourced in this state and other adjoining states have done a great job with getting the right kind of genetics that the consumer demands. The bottleneck is there's only so many spaces to get them killed here or processed here, and the truth be told, we don't quite have enough cattle, so we got to bring cattle in from other sources. And then, as we've talked about real recently, the feeding space here is very competitive, and we're competitive with the dairy industry, not only here in this area, in the Columbia Basin, but in Sunnyside, the Treasure Valley area. And so we're always competing with with another beef source for those high quality feeds. And so our input costs here in the Northwest are high and will remain high. And so once we need more money for those cattle, but it's tougher to get that money out. And if we try to transport them, especially in this market, transportation cost is limiting, marketing those cattle in a, a more competitive setup that we might see in some other parts of the country.
Yeah, I think you captured all that really well. Thanks. What suggestions would you have for people that have smaller amounts of cattle? Maybe they can't put a full load of calves together to put on a video market, or yearlings or something like that. So they can't put a load of straight 600-pound steers or heifers or yearlings together. Do you have some advice for them and into this fall and late summer when they might want to be marketing?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Todd. I would tell you that anything that you have in history, if you have any history of feeding those cattle, I would have that at your fingertips. And I would tell you that any kind of genetic verification of, the bull battery that you're using, that's going to help you with opportunities. One of the biggest things, and it's probably the hardest one to do for most producers, is having calves that are weaned and ready for the next phase of production, going to the feedlot. And that's a costly venture. You would have to really do some financial calculation to make sure it makes sense, and you can gain some advantages by doing that. But those cattle are valued. Cattle that have a good health program behind them, have some genetic verification of the kind of cattle that we expect. If you're set in the feeder's chair buying those cattle, what kind of performance you expect from them. And the history, I mean, today, I think you're going to find, if you go out and study the cattle that are, doing well, they've got a history. And what I mean by that is either you fed them, or you got connections that have fed the cattle before and they do what they're supposed to, from a health perspective. The small number is harder to do. And as I alluded to there at mid-year, trying to get together and make a load, even if you're just going, off the ranch, if you could get close to load with your neighbors or similar weight class cattle and all one sex, either all steers or heifers. I think that's something that's worth exploring. And I mean, visiting with, and they may not be adjacent to your fence, but if you can get them in a close proximity, you may be able to add some value. But you really got to all work together, have the same mindset. In this market, I think and I always believe this, I think where there's a good opportunity is the coal side of your operation, is 10, 12% of your annual income. And I would be very, very aggressive in that decision-making process. I realize we got as much feed in most parts of Oregon as we've had in 2 or 3 years, but going into it, we're going to feed the highest priced hay we've ever probably fed as operators, at least in my history here in 25 years. And I would be pretty hard on the culling side and capture the value, not wait till the fall. If you got open heifers or cows, that need to go down the road, bulls that aren't doing their job, when you take them out of the cows and good flesh, I would market them cattle early and often, because I think you'll help that side of the equation. I do tell you, if you've got yearling cattle, and I'm saying just taking them right straight to the barn maybe in a feeder cattle special here in the next 2 months or 3 months, those yearling cattle are going to be in high demand. And I think we'll see that on the video markets next week. We may not be able to garner the same kind of prices, but the placement of cattle right now is pretty light. And so I think there's going to be a pretty high demand for these bigger yearling cattle going into the early part of this sales season.
Yeah. And so I guess that leads up to one of my last questions here. What can people realistically expect this year? We've seen some early video sales. What are you seeing out there, and what might that reflect in Northwest prices here?
I would say the early videos, and I'm quoting Midwest prices. There was very few cattle in there from the Western United States, but they were up about 14 to 17%, in particular on the steers. Cattle are going to feed more efficient. So, and then I'm not pulling any statistics here, but last year you were looking at 1,050 to 1,100 or dollars per head for these calves, and I think you're going to add a couple $100 to that fairly easily. I think you're going to see a lot of cattle break $2 a pound. You're going to see some yearlings sell, kind of might blow your mind on what they'll bring, and I think part of that's based on cost of gain is going to be high, but those cattle will be doing it very efficiently. So I can't even guess. You might see some yearling cattle bring $1,700. Some big cattle that can go right to the yard and be on feed 90 or 100 days and be ready for harvest. So I think it's going to be very good. Can I tell you it's going to be enough to offset the bottom line? I think it's going to be a super challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to your cow statement earlier, we've seen a reduction, or I shouldn't say a reduction, but we've seen about 14% more nationwide, as I understand, year over year of cows going to market. In the short and long term, that's got to have an impact on availability of cattle in general here, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the statistics of it, and I just was reading this in the last few days, this will be the third or fourth year that our inventory is down quite a bit as of January 1. And that's happened probably 3, maybe 4 times since the early 70s. And usually the normal is that you're going to see a big spike in prices following that. The part that we maybe didn't have in the 13, 14 range, the 12 ranges, we didn't have what we're dealing with, inflationary price in our consumer. And so I think there's going to be a real increase in the price that's coming back to cow calf guy. And I don't, the input costs are just going to be what you have to really get around. And I think will be real key to tell a story on your cattle, from health, genetics, history, anything you've got to advertise that you are doing the very best. And there's one word out there that you hear, and it's beef care, and that kind of relates to sustainability. Even having a sustainable standard operating procedure that you can present to a buyer and say, this is what we're doing to make sure we're doing the best with, our cattle, our ranch, our employees, basically our environment. I think that'll carry some weight going forward. And I would have it prepared, even if you don't have it prepared for this set of calves. There's going to be money out there in the next 4 or 5 years just based on price. And those with the programs they'll get the most money.
Yeah. Well, we've certainly seen third-party verification bring more money in the past, and certain times considerable more money. So, yeah, any of those programs, I think you can add dollars to or a value. Lastly, and you touched on it a little bit, but when talking to Will Homer from Painted Hills Natural Beef at the mid-year, he was talking about difficulty selling some of the high-end cuts and the super demand that we're having for hamburger right now, and what that might do to our cow prices into the future.
Yeah, and I think it's carried through. I guess I haven't studied what happened through the holiday, but the thing that's interesting, it's one of the few times in history we've been competitive with chicken and pork. And their higher end cuts are costing more. And so I don't want to use the word alternative, but ground beef is the affordable option. And what's interesting, anytime you study consumer demand, when they have money, they buy beef. This is an interesting situation, is where money is tight, they're buying beef because it's one of the cheaper options at the meat counter. And history would tell you that hasn't happened very often. I mean, if you look at the mid 1995, 96, chicken was really kicking our butt. And today I think we're playing hardball with them. And I don't think chicken saw it coming. I think they got jammed up and supply chain caught them too. And we're really in a good spot right now. So it from the meat packer's perspective, it may make them want to pay less for our cattle because those high price cuts are going to move a little bit slower until we get back into that season where people want higher end cuts again.
Yeah. Well, Clint, I'm going to wrap this up. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I just think, again, you got to tell your story. If you really have done everything right in over years, decades, whatever, be willing to share that with the buyers. I think a lot of times we're complacent about that, or we just take it for granted that everybody's doing the same job. And I'll just be honest, not everybody is doing the same job. Some people are just doing the bare minimum. So tell your story, and there's some options out there. I mean, this verified genetics, I think in the future is something that's very important. As we have to make the cattle be more efficient, verifying which ones are coming from the right kind of genetics. These feeders are going to pay attention to that.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your dedication to Oregon cattlemen's and for serving the greater good here. You've certainly been a great asset to us, and appreciate the time here this morning.
Yep. Thank you, Todd.